all the IT's up and running, so we'll hand over to you.
Okay, so welcome everyone to this continuing bi-monthly seminar series that we're running certainly into next year in the wake of the aftermath of the COVID crisis. Not that we're over the COVID crisis yet by any means, so far as I can make out. If everybody could go to mute, Viviane will talk for sort of 20 to 30 minutes, and then there will be 30 minutes for discussion. For those of you on Zoom, either put your hand up for the discussion or indicate in the chat box that you would like to participate, and I'll call you at the right time. For those of you on YouTube, if you could put your question in YouTube, that will be passed to me, and I will pass it on as part of the discussion. So this month's speaker is Dr. Viviane Quirke from Oxford Brookes University, where she's senior lecturer. She has researched and written extensively about the history of drugs and the pharmaceutical industry in Britain, in France, and the United States. She is currently deputy editor of Ambix and a member of the SHAC Council. Most recently, she co-edited with Peter Reed a special issue of Ambix entitled Chemistry Consultants and Companies, circa 1850 to 2000. That was the August 2020 issue. And today, really very topically, she's going to talk about drug development from Salvarsan to COVID vaccine and between science and magic. Viviane.
Thank you very much, Frank, for your introduction and also for the invitation to talk to SHAC about some of my thoughts concerning the COVID crisis and how it links to my research. I think quite a few of us in this field of history of science, technology and medicine, as we've been, going through the pandemic, have thought, well, actually, I'd have quite a bit to say about this. I decided to talk quite generally about drug development over a long time period, and I'll do my best to do it in the 30 minutes allocated to me. I'm trying to change slides. Hopefully it will happen. It seems to be frozen.
Is it not working, Viviane?
It's frozen, I think.
Right.
I was able to change before.
We changed it all before.
Shall I stop sharing and try it
stop
again?
Sharing and reshare. Sorry about this. Viviane
Okay.
and I had practiced beforehand that these things do happen. Right.
Let's try now.
Yeah.
There we are.
Brilliant.
So yes, so one of the things that struck me about a year ago, when I started thinking about this and thinking about a potential new project, was that with the COVID pandemic, the public was being exposed more than ever before to the concepts and methods of science, whether it was epidemiology, immunology, or even pharmacology. And amongst the pictures I've put up for you here are pictures, almost ubiquitous pictures of the virus itself, of the COVID virus, and with its protruding spike proteins. And the explanation has often been given that the vaccine itself, but also any drugs used to combat the virus, targeted this spike protein, which is what enables the virus to enter the host cell in the body, in the human body, via receptors in order to replicate within that cell and thereby cause an infection. However, there's also been a resurgence of older beliefs which appear closer to magic and religion, than to science, beliefs one might laugh at concerning the vaccine, its origins and its potential effects, that sort of reminded me of some teaching I do at Brookes in the history of medicine, and this image that I've often brought out concerning the history of vaccination, the well-known cartoon by James Gilray showing the effects, imaginary effects of the cowpox vaccine on the human body, with people's skin bursting into cow heads or themselves being transformed into partially into hybrid humans and cows. However, rather than laughing at anti-vaxxers, a recent correspondence in The Lancet urged us to consider anti-vaxxers in the same way as vaccine hesitancy, as a religious movement rather than a cult, that's to say a non-conforming ideology with beliefs that are unacceptable to mainstream society. Instead, we were encouraged to adopt a more constructive perspective and view the anti-vax movement as a religious phenomenon involving a whole spectrum of ideas, and focus on the essential need to understand the beliefs that are involved to avoid further marginalization. This magical thinking that we saw around the vaccine has not been limited to vaccines. It's been extended to drugs like hydroxychloroquine. I don't know if you remember this drug, which was hailed as a possible lifesaver about a year ago. It was promoted by Dieterle, who is a specialist in infections and tropical diseases and a professor of microbiology at Marseille. He advocated hydroxychloroquine as a sort of panacea for all the symptoms of COVID, and presented it really pretty much as a kind of miracle cure. However, he was very quickly criticized by his colleagues, including Dr. Roni Brauman, who is a doctor specializing in tropical diseases and epidemiology and a former president of Médecins Sans Frontières, so Doctors Without Borders. And this is what he said about Raoult. He said, the way in which Didier Raoult has presented chloroquine, as hydroxychloroquine, as a miracle drug is more like a prophet than a health specialist. Since then, and some of the articles I've put links for on my screen for you, the drug has been tested finally in clinical trials, and it's been shown to be toxic and also not to have the wonderful effect that Raoult advocated. But nevertheless, reading the press in France, there seemed to be quite a group of followers who believe in him almost like a sort of messianic figure. And when you see his picture, that may not be so a surprise to you, a misunderstood messianic figure, in fact. So it probably shouldn't surprise us, this reception and this belief and the sort of adverse reception of hydroxychloroquine, because drugs have occupied a special place at the heart of both ancient and modern medicine and at the intersection between science, magic, and religion. The beliefs in the magical powers of drugs did not disappear with the advent of modern scientific medicine. They've often been referred to as wonder drugs, magic bullets, or miracle cures, especially when the effects of these drugs have been dramatic, leading to visible improvements in patients' conditions, or producing long-term survival from diseases which had previously been considered to be death sentences, such as cancer, and of course, AIDS comes to mind. Therefore, in this paper, I want to explore the way in which the boundary between science, magic, and religion has remained blurred, but look at it not just on the public side of the boundary, but also on the scientific side. My plan for doing this is to look first of all at the first magic bullet and the elixir of life, then to move on to the wonder drugs and miracle cures of the 20th century, and then to home in more specifically on the shift from antibacterial to antiviral chemotherapy. So to begin with, the first magic bullet and the elixir of life. They are two possible strands for my talk here, but I've chosen to specifically look at the magic bullet story and just introduce you to the elixir of life story, because it's a rather nice one and it fits quite well with our story of science and magic. So the first magic bullet was devised by Paul Ehrlich, who was born to a German Jewish family in Strelen in Lower Silesia, which is now in Poland. He obtained his doctorate in medicine and started working at the Charité Hospital in Berlin, where he worked on histology, pathology, and the chemistry of dyes. And it's that sort of, as Tony Travis has shown very well, is that chemical understanding of dyes that combined with his knowledge of immunology, which he developed when he joined Robert Koch's staff at the Berlin Institute of Infectious Diseases to work on serum research and testing, that led him to postulate that the selectivity of immune responses was due to molecules extending from cells, side chains containing receptors. And at the same time, the fact that the bacterium causing syphilis had been discovered led Ehrlich to really imagine a magic bullet capable of treating the disease without harming the host. Now, when he used the term magic bullet, it didn't come out of nowhere. It actually was a term borrowed from German folklore, from the tale of Freischütz, a marksman or hunter who obtained through a contract with the devil a certain number of bullets destined to hit without fail whatever object he wished. It was dramatized by Carla Maria von Weber in his opera Der Freischütz in 1821. And this opera became so popular all over Europe that it in fact helped to introduce opera as a musical form to a wider public, not only in Germany, but also I found references to it in Britain and in France, so that the myth of the magic bullet entered popular culture in that way, very widely. Now, I said I would also introduce you to the elixir of life, just briefly, and then I'll go back to the magic bullet strand in my story. The elixir of life was associated with another scientist, this time an American-French scientist called Charles-Édouard Brown-Séquard, who was born in Mauritius. He graduated in medicine in Paris, after which he traveled back and forth between the US, from where his father came, London as well, and Paris. In 1889, he reported to the Société de Biologie in Paris that a midwife had used the filtered juice of guinea pig ovaries to treat women suffering from hysteria, various uterine affections, and debility due to old age. He also reported on his own self-experimentation with injections of crushed animal testicles diluted in water, which he argued produced in him at 72 years of age renewed vigor and mental clarity. The preparation became mockingly known by his colleagues and by association with the quacks, who were gradually being marginalized at that time as Brown-Séquard's elixir. Nevertheless, it led to renewed popular and scientific interest in animal extracts, organotherapy to treat a variety of ailments, and eventually to, it sort of encouraged research in the field, which eventually led to hormone replacement therapy in the 20th century. Now, the elixir of life is a reference to ancient remedies. For example, Dr. Salmon's New London Dispensatory of 1684 mentioned the use of the genitals of dogs by magicians to provoke lust. However, by the 18th century, these were branded quack remedies. The elixir of life also refers to the myth of the fountain of youth, which was revived in the 19th century. Although it was an ancient legend going back to Herodotus, it became attached in the 16th century to Juan Ponce de Leon, the first governor of Puerto Rico, who allegedly traveled to Florida in search of the mythical spring that restores the youth of anyone who drinks or bathes in its waters. Popular attractions built in Florida were built in Florida as early as the 1860s, and it is possible that Brown Séquard actually became aware of these attractions on his travels. And unsurprisingly, because this tale was becoming part of popular culture in the second half of the 19th century, his professional colleagues, as well as the public press, likened Brown Séquard to Ponce de Leon. I will leave this story there, much as I would love to continue with it, and go back to the magic bullet and how it led to some of the wonder drugs and miracle cures of the 20th century, in particular in relation to viruses. In 1909, with his colleague Shiro Hata, Ehrlich developed compound 606 arsphenamine, also known as Salvarsan, which was launched as a cure for syphilis in 1911. Based on the principles established by Ehrlich, the first broad-spectrum sulfur drug, Prontosil rubrum, would be developed by Gerhard Domack at Bayer in 1932, but in the intervening period, there were several drugs developed for the treatment of tropical diseases, sleeping sickness, for example. In the 1930s and 40s, followed by numerous other sulfur drugs targeting a number of different bacterial infections, such as MNB 693, which was known for curing Churchill of pneumonia during the Second World War. Following this sort of series of magic bullets, if you like, came the first known use of the term wonder drug according to the Merriam-Webster dictionary. So that term wonder drug was closely associated with these sulfur drugs developed throughout the interwar period. And according to Lesch, who's written the history of the sulfur drugs, it marked the opening of an era of miracle drugs. Dr. Ehrlich's magic bullet, the film which was made by William Dieterle in 1940, was made in that context, as well as the context, of course, of the Second World War and the war against Germany. He portrayed Ehrlich as a kind of secular saint rather than a brash and bold magician, devoted above all to his mission to design targeted therapies for common diseases, and a martyr suffering for his cause in the court, literally, of scientific as well as public opinion. By 1944, the medical armory was expanded and improved due to side effects and growing bacterial resistance affecting the sulfonamides by penicillin and other antibiotics. And that led to the first known use of miracle drug, according again to the Merriam-Webster Webster Dictionary. Now, the term was used in a book written by Boris Sokolov in 1949, so very quickly after the development of penicillin. And Boris Sokolov was an American medical researcher who wrote for both a general audience as well as a scientific audience about this sense of dramatic change that was taking place as a result of the sulfonamides and penicillin. In 1949, so barely 10 years after Boris Sokolov's book, André Maurois, the French novelist and biographer, wrote a biography of Sir Alexander Fleming, who was referred to jokingly, but also sort of affectionately as Private 606, because in the First World War, he had been on the front in France, injecting soldiers very enthusiastically, apparently, with Salvarsan. And that's what the cartoon bottom right on the screen illustrates. Now, what Maurois wrote about when he described Alexander Fleming was an image of a scientist which was very similar, in fact, to Ehrlich. He described him as a rather modest, but also passionately devoted scientist to his single cause, which was to hunt for a substance which would be able to kill the pathogenic microbes without damage to the patient's cells. Pure chance deposited this substance on his bench, almost by sort of divine inspiration. But had he not been waiting for 15 years, he would not have recognized the unknown visitor for what it was. So it was, you know, a reference there to Pasteur's prepared minds. But viruses appeared resistant to chemotherapy, although some of them were preventable by vaccines, some of them, but not all of them. The properties and obstacles identified by Émile Roux in 1903 would need to be overcome before drugs could be developed against viruses. These properties and obstacles were that they could pass through filters which retained bacteria. They were invisible under light microscopes. They would not grow on bacterial culture plates. Therefore, viruses remained shrouded in mystery and continued to generate fear. And this fear was accentuated by pandemics such as the Spanish flu in 1918-20. These obstacles were overcome between the 1900s and the 1930s with the refinement of filter pores, with new cell culture techniques, in particular in eggs containing chick embryos, because the membranes surrounding the chick embryos would help to make the viruses visible. And the advent, of course, of electron microscopes in 1938. But there was also the discovery after the Second World War of the structure of DNA, which opened up a new approach to combating viral infections, interfering with DNA replication without harming the host cell. So the aim was still to target the virus, but without harming the host cell, which had been one of the great difficulties previously, since the virus replicates inside the cell. And one of the first examples I've come across was that of Marlborough, which was developed as a treatment against smallpox at Burroughs Wellcome in 1963, and which works by inhibiting messenger RNA synthesis. Now, Burroughs Wellcome would become one of the companies that specialized and had great successes in antiviral chemotherapy. And elsewhere, I've given talks about its research program in antiviral chemotherapy, and I'm currently writing on an article on the topic. Now, Burroughs Wellcome, for those who don't know, was an Anglo-American company, which is now part of the giant GSK, and this research program would eventually lead to acyclovir or Zavirax in 1974 and zidovudine, AZT or retrovir in 1984. The introduction of miracle drugs like penicillin and cortisone in the 1940s had provided physicians with a curing power never seen before. Here I'm quoting from Peter's excellent book on interferon, where he explores what I'm interested in here in relation to interferon. Inscribed at first in Ehrlich's research program, the powerful analogy between interferon and the miracle drug penicillin helped to explain interferon's stimulating effect on British science and industry in the 1960s, before it sort of fell out of favor in relation to, as an antiviral drug, was reinvented as an anti-cancer drug in a different location in the US in the 1970s, then in the 1980s as a new form of therapy based on natural substances present within the body, which we are becoming more familiar with now because of COVID, namely immunotherapy, which includes monoclonal antibodies. However, the next stage, and which brings us closer to the COVID crisis in the history of antiviral chemotherapy, is a crisis, the AIDS crisis, which shows the mobilizing power of crises such as the one we're experiencing now. And therefore, we might ask ourselves, you know, what might come out of this particular crisis. But going back to the AIDS crisis, AZT, which I've already mentioned, was approved by the FDA quite quickly in 1987. However, it followed similar cycles of hope and disappointment as interferon. Nevertheless, it inspired a search for other similar drugs, some of which are being approved for in the fight against COVID. One of them is Pfizer's Paxlovid, which is a pill combining a protease inhibitor with ritonavir, an old antiretroviral drug used to treat HIV and dating back to 1996. The other one is Merck's Lagevrio, which has its common name molnupiravir, which I discovered when I was doing research for this talk tonight, is named after Thor's hammer. So it's similar to Tamiflu and Zavirax in that it interferes with viral DNA replication. Now, I want to say a few words about the imagery on my screen there before I move on to my concluding comments, as my half hour's almost up. First of all, when I talk about the mobilizing power of crises, which really has been likened to fighting wars, and the kind of mobilization that we've witnessed in COVID has been similar and drawn on metaphors which are warlike. But for those of you who, like me, are old enough to remember the AIDS crisis, some extremely powerful images were associated with them. And one of them was that terrifying government ad asking people to get tested and to beware of the risks of AIDS with this monolith. And this, at the time, reminded me of the 1968 film the closing shot of the 1968 film by Stanley Kubrick, of course, 2001 Space Odyssey. Now, the bottom right image is one linked to Molnupiravir, Thor's hammer. And I was thinking, well, you know, that's an interesting image to use, which goes back to myths that are potentially quite old, like the Fountain of Youth, if we're looking back at Viking mythology. But I think they're probably connected to popular culture, in particular the recent fashion for Marvel comics and Marvel hero films. But the hammer, I guess, is sort of like a reinterpretation of the magic bullet, in that it gives an idea of immense power as well as targeted power through the hammer. Anyway, I thought this would be an amusing closing slide for you before I come to my concluding comments. Ehrlich and Brown-Séquard were both surrounded at the end of the 19th century and or inspired by popular tales of magic. And I think the term inspiration is very important here. I've come across, or I've interviewed scientists who have told me that when they joined the pharmaceutical industry to do research there, they were inspired by research, by the promise of magic bullets against cancer in particular in the 1950s. Science and magic are therefore not mutually exclusive, not even now, but sit at the boundary between the scientific and the popular imagination, thereby making it a fluid rather than a rigid boundary. Nevertheless, what I hope with my sort of longue durée tale is to have shown that a shift followed Ehrlich and Brown-Séquard's discoveries, with scientists and the products of science, in particular drugs, increasingly occupying the magical space within the popular, but also the scientific imagination. Ehrlich's discoveries offered hope sustained by those who followed him, with their drugs serving almost as self-fulfilling prophecies. However, there have also been disappointments. And here I could draw the parallel with COVID. We've seen so many ups and downs in the space, in a relatively short space of the COVID crisis, with drugs like hydroxychloroquine and some failed vaccines. Both the successes and the failures embody the cycles of promise and disappointment concerning individual drugs, as well as medicine more generally, which deserve greater historical scrutiny for their historically contingent, not only as individual case studies, but over the longue durée. For they are also responses to a basic human need for heroes as well as for hope in responses to crises, such as the COVID pandemic. So thank you for listening.
Demute myself. Thank you, Viviane. That was wonderful. So really interesting analysis of the metaphors used by medics and scientists and the general public. And so exercising my usual chair's prerogative of asking the first question while people put their questions into chat or raise their hands or put it into YouTube chat. Who's actually, how conscious do you think are people using these metaphors? Because I mean, there are a lot of metaphors you alluded to, magic bullet, elixir of life, wonder drugs, miracle drugs, fountain of youth, etc. Who's using them? Is it the scientists themselves as a sort of effort of trying to communicate the really difficult science and medicine that they're working on to the general public, or is it sort of general public trying to get some kind of grip on the medicines, which after all they're going to have to consume in some sort of sense? So who's using it and how do they actually operate?
That's an excellent question. Thank you. Well, certainly, I hope to have shown that Paul Ehrlich used the term magic bullet in reference to that folktale, the German folktale, and the term the elixir of life was used by, maybe not by Brown-Séquard himself, because it obviously would have attracted criticism and would have reinforced the criticism that he was behaving like a quack, but certainly colleagues and the public thought of it that way. And I guess what I've been trying to argue is that there's not such a boundary, even though there might be reluctance of scientists to admit to thinking magically. There's not such a rigid boundary between the two, men as, and women, scientists, female scientists, grow up as children, as members of the public before they become scientists. And I think maybe the reference to the miracle is sometimes slips out when they talk in interviews more privately about their astonishment and the amazement at some of the transformations brought on in the laboratory, but also in the clinic by some of the drugs they develop. I don't know if that helps to answer you. I think, it's been used over time by both the public and, journalists and scientists, but often more cautiously by scientists and in certain contexts. I would just add that I do wonder to what extent the sort of general broad education, almost like humanist education that would have been had by scientists in the late 19th century and into the beginning of the 20th century, would be the case now with much earlier specialization in the science. Would scientists be as aware of some of those metaphors and references when they use the terms miracle drugs? I mean, that's a question for the audience as well as for you, Frank.
Okay. Well, I won't follow it up now because we've got three people queuing up to ask questions. So the first was Sally Horrocks. Sally?
Great. Yeah, thanks very much, Viviane. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Yeah.
Nice
Brilliant.
to see you, Sally.
I could ask you loads and loads of questions, so I'll just confine myself to one. I was very struck by the range of examples coming from different countries, America, UK, Germany, France. And I wondered if you're deliberately not dwelling on national characteristics here, or whether there's a sense of national characteristics emerging within what you're talking about here, and whether some countries are kind of more credulous to these sort of extravagant claims than others. And then I kind of wondered also whether it would be very interesting to look at countries in the global south and some of how these kind of phenomena play out there as well. So I'd just be interested in your thoughts on that.
Yes, thank you. Another excellent question. Thank you, Sally. Yes, I did resist the temptation to give loads of examples of so-called miracle drugs from France. One example I thought I might explore subsequently in this project is the memory of water, which, one could say, well, there's the miracle drug and then there's the scientific proof, if you like, of how it works and why it works. Now, for those, I don't know if some of you have heard of the memory of water story, which is what a group of French scientists a couple of decades ago tried to explain scientific how and why homeopathy works. And they argued that despite the extreme dilution of homeopathic remedies, of the initial, if you like, active material, there was something in water that remained that actually helped to explain the effectiveness of homeopathy. And I did ask myself similar questions to you, Sally. Is it possible that there is greater credulity or less affinity to pragmatic, sort of, demonstrable scientific method? And of course, that question, would have to be dealt with very carefully. We can sort of smile at it a bit when talking about France, but when talking about the global South, that would, change how we talk about it quite dramatically, I suspect. I don't know if that helps to answer your question.
That was perfect. Thank you.
Okay, well, Bud.
Hello, thank you very much for a very interesting talk, Viviane. I really had two questions. The first is the distinction between what we call quack medicines and scientific medicines. You've given a sort of succession of drugs that fundamentally did work. But there are many more drugs which the tradition of calling drugs miracle cures goes back a lot further than you're talking about. I've just looked it up and found Clark's miraculous salve from the 1850s. And certainly you might have talked about Yadil, which around 1918 was being cited as the cure, a miraculous cure. It turned out to be formalin, formaldehyde solution. But that took a couple of years, and before it was exposed by Pope, it was very widely advertised and used, I think, as a cure for the influenza. So there's one question, which is how justified are we to be dismissing, separating completely the tradition of what we call proprietary medicines from the tradition of scientific medicines? And then the second question, which relates to this, is how much did the promoters of the scientific medicines, such as Ehrlich, not believe in these ancient stories which you cite, but actually deploy them to market their product? And I'm thinking very specifically of Zauberkugel, which is not a well-known German term. Everybody knows Freischutz, but in Freischutz, the term is Freikugel. The term Zauberkugel comes from an edition of Faust, not Goethe's Faust, the 17th century Faust, which was reprinted in the 1850s. And so it would have been known to Ehrlich and appears in Grimm's dictionary. But I propose to you that actually Ehrlich, as a marginal Jew, is using this term, which related to not war, but hunting. And yes. Zauberkugel was a sort of discus which the Lapps threw at animals, and it was attracted to the animal, and he took a poison to them and killed them. So to what extent was he using this to explain what he was doing in terms, as you say, that would be familiar to his user, to his, maybe even to his peers rather than just his customers? But I suppose both of these are very, that managing the relationship between scientific medicine and proprietary medicine seems to be a major issue right through your story.
Yes, I agree. And in fact, what I tried to hint at was the fact that the boundary with quack medicine was actually quite a contested boundary, particularly at the time when Brownsicker and Ehrlich were developing their remedies. The interwar period, by the time we get to the interwar period, that boundary seems much less contested. It seems to me to be a fairly quiet period in relation to that boundary between professional medicine and quack medicine, although there's a new frontier for quack medicine, which is cancer, which appears at that time. And it made me think that actually what you might also have is whenever you have a focus on a particular disease, like cancer, which is you're starting to have scientific inroads into it with radium therapy, with the advent of radium therapy. The quack doctors sort of tend to piggyback on that. And I guess the same thing has been happening with COVID as well, because you only have to remember, I think it was it Trump who famously advocated not formaldehyde, but bleach, ingesting bleach or some disinfectant. So I think the periodization is something we have to pay attention to. There were rules and regulations that were marginalizing quacks at the time when Ehrlich and Brown-Séquard discussed their remedies. But you make an interesting point that in some ways, in many ways, Ehrlich is borrowing language that would have been used by these quack doctors. Now, whether it was marketing to whom? I think, not marketing to the public, but marketing to, maybe you're right, his colleagues, to convince them, talking to a public that would have been well informed. But I think there's more than that. I mean, what I've seen, in talking to some of the scientists, there's an element of self-belief as well. That, yes, it is, that imagery is so powerful that it does help them to crystallize some of the scientific ideas that they have. So I think there's a kind of operational role for those metaphors and those images. Now, your second question on, can you remind me what it was? Sorry,
well,
I didn't write it down.
The second one was you've combined them. I think you've answered. But I think that there's a very self-conscious marketing to other scientists. If you talk about crystallization, there's one thing to say, Ehrlich, what ideas did Ehrlich have in his head when he was inventing this? It's quite different to say, what ideas did Ehrlich put in the heads of other scientists to convince them that his idea was good? And the Zauberkugel was a good metaphor.
Yeah.
A useful metaphor. But a useful metaphor. And I think that just to say he believed in it is not necessarily correct. It may be just that he's using it as a metaphor, which he knows that other people will understand and actually is appropriate for his particular medicine.
Yes, no, that's a good point. Thank you.
Okay, John Christie's next. John.
Hello, everyone, and thanks very much indeed, Viviane. My thought just follows on from much of what we've been talking about so far, to do with the phrase, the magic bullet, the Zauberkugel. I know about Freischutz, but only because I had a brother-in-law who was an opera singer, and indeed I saw him in the opera of Freischutz in Nuremberg, as I recollect. But how does the story end?
It ends badly.
The whole point of the story is you have 6 bullets which obey your wish. The 7th does not. And how did you get these bullets in the first instance? Robert is right. This is a Faustian story. You get them with a contract with the devil. So this is a story with a very bad sting in the tail for the discoverer and the user of the magic bullets. So I'd like to know, I mean, could Ehrlich actually have been conscious of that? It strikes me as a rather dodgy metaphor in many ways, if it may rebound on the discoverer and the user according to the full metaphor of the tale. Do you see what I mean, Viviane?
Yes, I do actually. I was wondering about that, but I think that's where you're helping to answer Robert's question, which is, that the metaphor is embedded in a myth that is well known, but it's almost like separated from that myth. and it exists on its own, especially once it's embodied in a concrete object, such as this drug that he's, aiming for and making. And what's remembered is the fact that it hits its target and only its target, nothing else. But Robert, I think, could probably
my
say
point
more.
is that it doesn't come from Freischutz. I think Freischutz is a complete red herring, if I may say so. The word
I don't actually, Robert, I have to say.
Well, because it's not, he doesn't use the word Zauberkugel in Freischutz. Freischutz used the term Freikugel. However, there's a 17th century edition of Faust, in which Faust travels to Iceland, or the Northlands, and there he comes across the Lapps, who use Zauberkugel, and that's the word that's in the book. And there, there's no connotation of the devil. It's only that, I suppose, that Faust got up there, but he encounters the Lapps. And the Lapps use this Zauberkugel to kill animals. And it is attracted, it is magical, it goes to the animal, and there it takes a poison and kills the animal. So this is a separate thing from Weber and Freischutz.
Yes, it is separate, but if it's Faust, there are obvious Faustian echoes. That's what I think, anyway.
Yes, but it doesn't. It's not Faust himself who's using the Zauberkugel. It's the Lapps.
Can I sort of interrupt? And keeping on the same theme, Axel Huntelmann wants to sort of comment. Axel.
Oh yes, thank you very much, and thank you very much, Viviane, for that great talk.
Hi, Axel.
It was great. I was just want to mention, so Paul Ehrlich used quite a lot of metaphors just to make himself clear, because he was talking about invisible theories, things. Antitoxins were not that clear in 1894. And he used them to make his arguments clear. He also was talking about omnibuses, about butterflies, and all the sort of stuff, just to get his audience and his colleagues and fellows to come with him, or to understand what he was meaning, because he was quite criticized for his sidechain theory at that time too. The interesting thing is that the only metaphor that survived was a magic bullet, and I guess because it was so plastic, it was so important. And we have also to keep in mind, Paul Ehrlich was not really very much interested in opera or concerts or music and all this stuff. He was more or less in his laboratory. So probably we are talking about things. Ehrlich was some sort of he knew about it, but he was not having this directly in mind. He was more on practical things. But the interesting thing is that this survived, and that we are talking about magic bullets, because that was a metaphor that struck most of the people at that time, and it was common, so to say, that this is the metaphor we are now talking about. And this is also something interesting, that even in 1942, when Warner Brothers had this picture about magic bullets, and then with E.J. Robinson, the great actor who was normally more or less actor as a criminal, and with his magic bullet. So this was the metaphor that survived, so to say.
Yes, thank you for that point. And what I would also add is that, of course, one of the drawbacks of the sort of longue durée approach that I've adopted in this talk is that you talk about the metaphors that survived, the drugs that were successful, and the scientists who remained known, those that failed, those that apart from the examples I've given here, because they're very recent, like hydroxychloroquine, sort of aren't part of this story, if you like.
I mean, can I sort of throw in a bit about sort of the term magic bullet? I wasn't aware of any of these sort of connections with opera or Faust until now. But if you just think of it as a term, surely it implies quick and effective. Isn't that what it really means? And that's a way, in a sort of in a strong image of conveying a message to the patients who are going to receive whatever is in this magic bullet. I mean, what I'm saying is, if we go to Faust and the opera, are we simply over-interpreting this phrase?
Yes, I think actually I would like to point out here that I've seen other terms used. One is the silver bullet metaphor. So, I mean, the only thing that the silver bullet in my mind is what kills a vampire, but you know, if it goes into their heart. But the term has been used interchangeably with silver bullet. Now, it would be interesting to find out when that happens and why that happens. You know, if we're in the realm of, you know, mythology being mobilized to sell scientific ideas, to sort of formulate and express scientific ideas to oneself as well as to an audience that might be scientific or popular.
Judith Fields has her hand up. Judith.
I wondered, thank you very much for a very interesting talk, Viviane. I was brought up by two doctors, and so I was exposed to some of this. And I remember my mother, who was a GP, being impressed by the miracle when TB patients came back from the sanatorium. And that made me think of the rather ambiguous use of the word magic in the title of Der Zauberberg of Mann, which was a well-known novel at the time and probably still is, because the magic of the Magic Mountain doesn't exactly cure people, does it?
Yes, thank you for that point. The Magic Mountain, of course, I remember reading the book when I was beginning my studies in history of medicine, and I hadn't really thought of the parallel with other forms of therapy or treatment, but it's a good point. And I mean, you know, if you read the biographies of doctors who experience the introduction of penicillin in GP practices, for example, they talk about miracle as well. So it's also about the emotions felt by the person who witnesses the transformation brought on by some of these successful therapies.
Yes.
Axel, you put your hand up after that.
Yes, thank you very much. Viviane, I really like your longue durée approach. And I was wondering, so in Ehrlich times and later on in the 1940s, they were talking about magic bullets, but when we're talking about COVID nowadays, is there some sort of a similar metaphor, or is there something, or is it still the magic bullet, or do we have now something which is more common to our nowadays imagination? Or probably, and I was also wondering if some sort of an atomic bomb was probably also a metaphor in the 1970s or 1960s to get all rid of viruses, or had this any, so in what way is it dependent on the zeitgeist or on current weapon systems, so to say?
Oh, thanks for that question. Yes, I think the magic bullet does have remarkable longevity. I think it's lasted through, and it's been used by scientists throughout most of the period I've talked about today. Now, I don't know, I don't see the magic, the sort of atom bomb being welcomed as a metaphor, although as Robert Budd has pointed out, you know, there were strong parallels between, you know, the sort of Cold War and the threat of atom, you know, annihilation, and the war on cancer. So there are, you know, parallels between the fights between Cold War countries and the fight against cancer. But the amusing parallel I drew more recently, you know, for COVID, is that of Thor's hammer. Is that just due to the fact that it's the sort of zeitgeist of today? It's these Marvel movies, and it's more likely to be used as a marketable tool, because there's a bit of a, you know, a real marketing tool. There's a bit of a war going on between Pfizer and Merck. I was looking at that yesterday, and Pfizer are trying to discredit the Merck product, the Thor's hammer, which I believe has been authorized for testing here by the MRHA. I'm not sure, but there's a bit of a marketing war between them, and using images like that are certainly part of companies' marketing armory, to use another metaphor.
Okay, so we've come out of time. Thank you so much, Viviane. I think you've got a really, really fertile field of research looking at metaphors and how they're used and who uses them, and just introducing a new one with company competition. So before I close, just a quick reminder, next in this series will be on the 27th of January, and we'll be issuing further details later on. Although not a SHAC event, on the 6th of December, the Royal Society of Chemistry historical groups running a one-day meeting on life and work of George Porter, a very distinguished Nobel Prize winning chemist. Registration closes on the 30th of November. It's free, by the way. And if you just type in George Porter, Royal Society of Chemistry Historical Group, 6th of December, I'm sure you'll find it. Seminars like this just don't happen because we press buttons. Various people press buttons, and there's a whole team behind it to deliver these online seminars. And this one has been organised by Rob Johnson, Anna Simmons, Caroline Cobbold, Becky Martin, Chris Campbell, and Joe Hedison. But of course, it couldn't have happened without Viviane Quirke's wonderful presentation. So thank you so much, Viviane, and also for provoking a really interesting discussion on all these issues. So one of the sort of great drawbacks of sort of online seminars is you can't really indicate appreciation.
Thank you for all the questions. So very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Viv.
I've stopped too early. Happy Christmas and happy Thanksgiving.